Hi, folks. Well, I feel like I've decided to cause a little controversy with my latest undertaking here. And what I've done is I've taken a hard look at the TI-99 classics and pared down my list of favorite original era TI-99 games to just the top 15. Just 15 games that I think represent the best in TI-99 gaming in the 1980s era. Now, in more recent years, TI-99 game development has been taken to the moon and back in a way that, well, early 80s TI-99 gamers just couldn't have dreamed of. Stuff like Dragon's Lair or Realms of Antiquity. But I'm not talking about that stuff here, great though it is. Here I'm just trying to cut it down to 15 80s era classics that defined the platform in its heyday, and that I think represent it best even today. And yeah, I know it ought to be a top 10 list, right? This is YouTube. But I swear, getting down to only 15 was hard enough. I just couldn't cut it down any shorter. It was already pure unmitigated violence to cut the list of my favorite TI-99 classics to only 15. As for what I looked at in ranking these games, well, first off, I looked at playability, just asking how fun a game is in any era at all. How straightforwardly enjoyable do I find it today? Because some games that are unique or interesting for their design just aren't necessarily as fun to play as they are to, well, talk about or design or philosophize about. Like TI Congo Bongo here, genuinely cool concept, but it just doesn't play as well as the non-isometric platformers for the system. So, interesting though it may be, playability matters, and Congo Bongo's not on this list. And I also looked at challenge and replayability. Whether once you get a handle on the gameplay you've still got some difficulty curve to climb or a reason to play again. If after a few plays the game's as solved as it's ever going to get, then that's not great. Like in Super Demon Attack here, where the demon-based boss mechanic just breaks on the third cycle, meaning that you're pretty likely to reach the end of that curve in the space of an afternoon. Then I looked at graphics and sound, since, well, I want to see the TI-99 used well in those ways, given how capable that little VDP is. So as important as Tombstone City is to the platform, particularly given the source code taught a lot of people the basics of TI-99 assembly, well, Tombstone City takes a hit in the graphics department, and it's not on this list. I also looked at how unique a game was. As much as I and a lot of other 99ers played lots of TI Invaders in its time, well, it's a Space Invaders clone. So while it's a perfectly good one, it doesn't quite make the cut as far as a TI-99 best of list in 2021, to my mind. Memorable, but unremarkable. But it does matter how memorable a game is. It matters whether it's part of the TI-99 history. Whether it was a game that everyone was talking about at all the user group meetings in '84 and printing high scores for in the newsletters. Or whether, at the opposite extreme, it was developed but never released in the 1980s. Tutankhamun, for example, is a great TI-99 game, but we only got our hands on it belatedly, so it's not really part of the 1980s TI-99 experience at all, and it's not on this list. So that all having said, as we get this underway, let me reassure you that I'm looking forward to you folks telling me I'm wrong. And I do actually mean that, because if you do that, that probably means you'll tell me what classic TI-99 games you think are the best on the system. And I love hearing someone make a case for why a TI-99 classic ought to get more love and appreciation. By all means, tell me why Zero Zap is an underappreciated masterpiece, if that's how you feel about it. Or why Hunt the Wumpus was revolutionary. And I'll probably say, awesome. But if on the other hand you think these TI-99 classics I'm so high on aren't really up to snuff, and don't really deserve any of this credit I'm giving them, well, in that case, go to hell, I hate you. I'm right and you're wrong. Seriously, though, I totally want to hear what you have to say about these games, so have at 'em, by all means, for better or worse. Anyway, kicking things off at number 15 in my personal ranking, once all the numbers have been tabulated, I've got Popeye. One of two Nintendo titles for the system, the other one of those being Donkey Kong. Also an excellent game, by the way. This port having been done by Parker Brothers, while Donkey Kong was done by AtariSoft, in both cases independently of TI, much to TI's annoyance. Popeye ends up at the bottom of this list rather than anywhere higher up, mainly just because ports were available for Popeye for most systems of the day, so while it's a TI-99 game, it's a little less a TI-99 classic for that fact. It's also a pretty much anything else game, so, you know, a little lower on the classics list. Though it does still end up here because it's a platformer with some really cool ideas of its own, and as far as platformers and three-screen platformers of the day go, numerous though they were, it's pretty neat. And it looks and plays really well on the TI-99 specifically. So it's definitely more than just another Donkey Kong clone in a sea of Donkey Kong clones. Graphically, Popeye was never going to look like the arcade version of Popeye on any home platform in 1983, but this is a really good treatment for the home market. In a lot of respects, the TI-99 version looks like the ColecoVision version, which is what you expect, given the platforms share a DI-VDP. But with a major difference being that Popeye's sprite doesn't look like complete ass here. Just look at this difference. Popeye is not one of those titles that you'll hear people mention a lot when they're talking about the TI-99 classics. It came out in '84 after the platform was discontinued, for one thing. And furthermore, it came out as a third-party title, so there never would have been any first-party marketing through TI even if it had come out earlier. But furthermore, not only did TI pull out of the market, but Parker Brothers pulled out of the TI market as well, on TI pulling out, so there was very little third-party marketing for it in turn. And plus, being released amid a sea of Donkey Kong clones, and following the video game crash, well, a three-screen platformer being released in mid-1984 just wasn't very big news. So, it never really had its moment in the spotlight, sadly. But a good game is a good game, so it qualifies for this list as far as I'm concerned. And it's not just a good TI-99 game, it's a great version of Popeye, period. It might just be the best original home version from that initial group of ports Parker Brothers put out. So, while it might not be one of the very top tier for TI-99, it makes 15 on my list as just a good, fun platformer for the platform. So that's number 15 and only 14 to go. And from here we start getting a bit closer to the heart of the TI-99 library. Here we got a game that's legitimately the very best at what it does in the entire TI-99 library. And that's Championship Baseball, which is a first for the system in a whole lot of ways, and a first for video games in general even, in certain ways. This is a game that impressed the Consumer Electronics Show at Indies in '83 so much it got itself a New York Times story, reporting, "In a baseball game demonstrated to wide-eyed toy buyers this week, the player controls the movement of the ball on the screen by a series of statements made into a special microphone." Well, that's not exactly right. There's nothing special about the microphone, but it's not far off. What Championship Baseball actually is a baseball game that uses an analog joystick, a touch-sensitive keypad, voice input, and voice synthesis, which is, well, a whole pile of technology for 1983. So it's easy to see how it would have had folks wowed at CES. Voice synthesis lets the umpire say,
"Right."
Voice input lets me say, "First." Pitcher. A touch-sensitive keypad means I can press a location on the baseball field and have my player throw the ball there. And an analog joystick means I can adjust my pitch speed in analog. So, that's all pretty cool. The game's only downside today being, and it is a pretty big downside, that it requires an MBX expansion system connected to a TI-99 to use, and there is no emulation at present for the MBX expansion system, so only way to play it is original hardware. But can't blame the game for that, and as for the game, it's great. As a two-player baseball game, it does everything you want. The basic gameplay is fairly straightforward, of course. It's baseball. But the technological bells and whistles are really cool and make it more interestingly interactive than baseball usually would be at this point in history. So, Championship Baseball has an important place in TI-99 history. It has some great sound with voice synth umpire calls, and this great rendition of Take Me Out to the Ball Game. And otherwise, the graphics do their job well enough, and it definitely is a unique game on the platform. Voice features aside, the overlay makes a really nice contribution to the playability of this game by letting you just tap the locations on the baseball field to throw the ball there, and then providing you some options for your pitch as well. Whatever else this game is, it's the crowning glory of the MBX, for whatever that's worth. So while this isn't one that just anyone can play, given it needs a working MBX, it's one that made a big splash in the gaming world as a whole at CES and at TI-99 user groups subsequently, showing off its cool and unique technology. So I absolutely think this is one worth including at number 14 in our list of TI-99 gaming greats. So that was 14, and we've got 13 to go. And at number 13, we've got another game that's really the only one that does what it does on the TI-99 in the early 80s. That being Return to Pirate's Isle. A classic Scott Adams graphic adventure, with the graphic part being what makes it unique on the platform. Naturally, the TI-99 has plenty of other text adventures that were ported to the platform either sooner or later, but this one is the only one of the early 80s with graphics developed for the TI-99 itself. And Return to Pirate's Isle wasn't released on any other platform, just the TI-99. So, in that way as well, especially much a TI-99 classic. And furthermore, it's the sequel to an earlier Scott Adams title that did get a TI-99 release. So once again, TI-99 text adventure classic. It's as simple to play as any Scott Adams adventure, but the scenery really adds something. And while text adventures often aren't all that replayable, I think you can argue a treasure hunt style adventure like this is more replayable than most of them are, since there's no chance that you'll find everything on the first play. Finding more of what there is to find in the world is reason for more runs, and hopefully you'll find something new as you try and try and try again. It doesn't make the gameplay unlimited, of course, but it does give you reason to give it more than one go. There's no sound in the game, so nothing to be said for it there, but the graphics really do contribute nicely. And I particularly like how the game represents bad eyesight before you find your glasses, with these garbled graphics. Probably a few people were convinced that their machine was bugging out. Thought that was a nice touch, even if it is a tad malicious. So this is definitely a unique title, as the only one of its kind in the TI-99 original era. The fact that it all runs directly from a cartridge with no loading of disk or cassette data also just makes it more convenient and, well, more accessible to the entire TI-99 world. Even if all you've got is a bare console, this is one you can play, so that's nice. And all that put together makes the Return to Pirate's Isle cart the biggest name in TI-99 text adventures, and consequently a deserving title on any best of list, including this one. So that's 3 down, and moving on to number 12 in our top 15, we're back to another game which is the king of the genre on the system, And the genre here is flight simulators, believe it or not. The king of that particular castle on the TI-99 4A being SPAD 13 Mark II, which, well, that's a mouthful, but which you might otherwise know by the less of a mouthful title of its cartridge release, Red Baron. Until SPAD 13, the TI-99 didn't really have a full-fledged flight simulator at all. It had some instruments-only flight simulators like Dow 4 and Winging It, and eventually it had 4A Flyer as well, which looks kind of like a flight simulator, but isn't really simulating anything from a physics or geometry standpoint. Its creator John Phillips described it as a flight simulator simulator. So essentially, makes you feel like you're flying a flight simulator, but you aren't. Looks like one and acts like one, isn't one. But SPAD 13 Mark II, which is the second version of the SPAD 13 program, well, it makes some important additions, and it is everything that 4A Flyer wasn't. It's got multiple perspectives on the aircraft that are selectable in real time during play. It's got simulated environments that are at least kind of recognizable. It's got realistic flight physics that are described well in the manual. And you can even dogfight with the Red Baron now, which is where the cartridge release got its name, of course. The only downside here is that the frame rate is slow. So in terms of present-day playability, yeah, a 1987 flight simulator doesn't compete with what came after. But you gotta respect what it achieved, and just the fact that it achieved a full-fledged graphical flight simulation on a TI-99. So SPAD 13's kind of the opposite of Popeye as far as what gets it on this list. Popeye is a really good, fun, playable game, but as an early 80s platformer, which was late to the party, it's pretty unimportant to TI-99 history and the TI-99 library as a whole. If we'd never gotten one extra 3-screen platformer, we'd have done just fine, I think. SPAD 13, on the other hand, as a fairly complete flight simulator, is a really important addition to the platform. But on the other hand, being a flight simulation, it's not easy to pick up and play today. Flight, as it turns out, is kind of complicated, and if you're inclined to look at the frame rate and say 80s flight simulators are probably best left in the 80s, well, I can't really blame you. Nonetheless, I see this one as a true TI-99 classic, for what it adds to the platform and for general technical achievement. Alright, so that's 4 down, and we have a platformer, a sports title, a Scott Adams graphic adventure, and, against all odds, a flight simulator. But what comes next is a personal favorite of mine, from a company I am a big fan of, Imagic. And that's Fathom. Fathom is one of 4 Imagic titles that got a TI-99 release, and it's one we know was developed in-house at Imagic, rather than just farmed out to a third party. One reason we know that is thanks to Imagic's helpful policy of always crediting its programmers and game materials. Another is thanks to Imagic graphics guy Matt Sarconi, who stuck his initials on the title screen. Anyway, Fathom's as easy to get into as any game you'll find on the system. You just fly the skies or swim the seas, searching for pieces of Neptune's trident and collecting energy along the way, until you can head down to rescue Neptina in the depths of the ocean. Neptune's captive daughter, who's being held captive by an octopus? I guess. It's just a very easygoing action-adventure and exploration game that'll probably remind later gamers most of Echo the Dolphin. It's just pleasant and relaxing to play, and I really appreciate that it takes place in a large and contiguous world, in an era and on a platform where you don't get a whole lot of that. Fathom has some great voice synth and a female voice, and the graphics are lovely. Particularly that title screen that Matt Sarconi stuck his name on. But for that matter, the manual has some pretty fantastic art as well, and that really isn't a Magic staple, so you'll look for that. Until the video game crash saw their fortunes crash likewise at the end of '83, they always invested in making an Imagic product look fantastic. So Fathom is certainly a pretty unique title. I'm pretty sure it's the only game on TI-99 where you switch at will between being a dolphin and a bird, and collect stars and clouds and seahorses to defeat an evil octopus. Pretty one of a kind, but as well in the broader design and aesthetic. If you're looking for more serious arcade action, yeah, this is not it. You're not going to get your arcade challenge here. But sometimes I'm just looking to relax and play an escapist action-adventure, and this one does the trick for me. A full playthrough of all 9 levels is pretty long and challenging though, so playing Fathom definitely isn't going to be totally without challenge. Unless you watch the full playthrough of it I did and just copy that. Even then, it's going to take a while, and you probably won't remember all the Trident locations for next time. In the end, Fathom isn't all that challenging, but that's kind of the point. And it's pretty unique in the experience it does deliver. It was developed for other platforms as well, but the ColecoVision and Intellivision versions aren't really regarded as all that great, and the 2600 version's just fundamentally different. Regardless, I prefer the TI-99 version myself, and like its joust-style control mechanics better. While this isn't a TI-99 exclusive, consequently, I think it is best played on the TI-99, and the game deserves a place on this list as one of the TI-99 greats. Well, that's 5 down and I've got 10 to go, but I think I'm going to have to satisfy myself with getting to 11 in this video. Next time I'll take a look a little higher up the list at number 6 through 10 in my favorite 80s era TI-99 classics. But for today, it's been Popeye in platforming, Championship Baseball in sports, Return to Pirate's Isle in graphic adventure, SPAD 13 in flight simulation, and Fathom in action adventure. Not a bad package for a 1981 computer.